If you want to know why, when, and most importantly, how to prune your climbing roses, this is the video for you. Join me today as I prune my roses in the garden so that I get them to bloom like this all season long. Now, why do you want to prune your roses? You might just be like, oh, I just want to keep them like this and let them be. But pruning your roses is essential for your roses to thrive and survive. The main purpose of pruning is to create a beautiful, shapely plant that will encourage healthy growth on the plant all season long. You also want the rose to have a good coverage and base structure by removing some of the parts of the rose during the non-flowering season. Pruning kind of kickstarts new growth and encourages new bloom for the upcoming season. I also prune during the season while I'm deadheading the roses if I think they are getting too bushy or unmanageable. But most of the structural pruning that I want to do, I leave it for the season when the plant is not flowering. When should you prune? I definitely recommend pruning in late winter or early spring because that is the time your entire rose is dormant and is just waking up to set out these new branches, leaves, and blooms. Now, depending upon your zone, this time will vary from Feb to April. I did most of my regular rose pruning in late Jan, but I had left the climbing rose pruning until about first week of March. So it depends where you are in your zone, and this is an ideal time for you to start pruning. And even if you're in a warmer zone and if you've not pruned until now, it's still a good idea to prune so that you get a much more healthier and vibrant plant for the next season. Also, it is okay to prune earlier than this time, but it sometimes becomes harder to find the unhealthy parts of the rose, especially if you live in areas where there is a lot of snow and you cannot identify some of the dead or damaged parts of the plant. Climbing rose is unique in its part where you need some kind of a structure or support for the rose to be based on. There are two types of structures. Fixed structures where you can grow up on a wall or a fence or even sometimes on the side of a building. And the second one is a decorative structure where you can grow a rose on an obelisk or a pergola or a beautiful archway in your garden. So how to prune a climbing rose? And the pruning of the rose will change based on if it is a year 1 to a year 4 rose. And let's go through all the different stages. There are two main components that you need to look at. First is that you want to select and encourage new growth from the base of the plant. And second is to train the current stems in a fan-like structure so that they have ample amount of space to be able to spread and grow. A best way I find is to train a stem horizontally, which promotes shoots to grow vertically on each of their nodes. I love to use an espalier technique when I'm training my rose so that I have stems on 3 different levels. I'm training my roses on the backyard fence, and I want them to eventually cover the entire fence. So I'm creating different layers on it using this espalier technique. And depending on how you want to grow it, you might want to train the rose for that structure. If you want to remember one thing about how to train your climbing roses, just remember this one thing is to fan out the main branches horizontally rather than vertically so that you get a lot more branches coming out from each of the nodes rather than one branch just growing vertically. You will notice that your rose is getting healthier and bushier, and the more branches that shoot out from that one stem, the more blooms you're going to have. So let's talk about climbers growing on fixed structures. If you have a fixed structure like a wall or a fence or a side of a building, make sure you have some kind of wires or hooks already attached to the main surface that you want to train the rose on. If you're attaching wires, I would recommend doing it at 2 feet intervals from the ground up, and about 3 wires, one on top of each other, should suffice for one rose at one point in time. So if you have one of these climbers like James Galloway, like I do, or the Pilgrim, or Claire Thomas, or Wollerton Hall, one of the climbers that grows from about 10 to 15 feet. And if your rose starts getting taller, then you can add additional wires on 2 feet increments. So let's talk about out pruning and split it by different years. I'm going to start with year one. And the way we define year one is the first year that your rose has finished flowering. I have 3 roses in my garden that are year one roses. I have the Pilgrim, I have Strawberry Hill, and I have the Gertrude Jekyll rose. All 3 flowered last year for the first time. And although I didn't get a ton of blooms on the Pilgrim or the Gertrude Jekyll, I got a few. The one that performed really well for the first year was Strawberry Hill. It got a lot of blooms considering I had just planted it as a bare root rose. If you have a rose that you planted last year and has flowered, then this is what you need to do. At this stage, your rose is establishing its roots to have a much healthier plant in the future. So only very light pruning is required. Here are the 4 steps that you will need to do. Step 1 is to cut away any growth that is growing away from your structure and it cannot be tied back. Step 2 is remember the 4 Ds. Remove dead, dying, damaged, and diseased stems. Step 3 is if you have longer stems, now bend them at about 45-degree angle and tie them as horizontal stems against the wires. And step 4 is to remove any and all leaves from the plant. This is very important because you don't want any of the previous year's disease spores to be carried over on the next year's new and tender growth. Year 2, now this year for me is going to be a year that I'm allowing the plant to fully establish. Here are the 6 steps you will need to complete for your rose if it is in year 2. Step 1 is cut away again any of the growth that is moving away from the structure and you cannot tie it back. Step 2 is if your clamber is really vigorous, but you think that the plant is getting congested and it will not have enough breathing room, then remove any of the stems that are weaker. And here I usually like to look at stems that are thinner than size of a pencil. I usually just prune them off. So then I keep the more thicker and stronger branches on the plant. What I want to keep on the rose are these long, thick stems that are growing from the base of the plant that are going to give me the most amount of branches and flowers in the future. I don't want these tiny branches to take away most of the nutrition from the plant. So I'm pruning them up to the main stem of the plant and leaving just about 2 to 3 inches. Some of them I'm going all the way up to the base of the stem and just pruning them off. Step 3 is to cut any of the flowering stems about 6 inches from the main stem. Step 4 is again all of the 4 Ds, remove dead, damaged, dying, or diseased stems. Step 5 is to look at the plant and look at all the longer stems, pull them down to a 45-degree angle and tie it on the wires. Honestly, I have used a couple of things. I have used these plastic tie-ins, which were terrible, but I think I always come back to just a good jute thread. And I just like that because I can cut it off in the next season and it's biodegradable. And I don't worry about then plastic just staying in my garden and creating more waste. And step 6 is to remove all the leaves so that the spores don't get transferred onto the new upcoming growth. Now, if your plant is year 3 or more, like rest of my 10 roses are in my garden, I'm going to do all of the 6 steps from year 2. In addition to that, I'm going to cut away any of the old or weak stems at the base of the plant. This is what you're seeing me do for majority of my roses. Now, if you have climbers growing on decorative structures such as obelisks or arches, this section is for you. If you're growing a rose on an obelisk, remember to wind your rose stems around the obelisk so that the stems spiral around the structure. This will use the same principle as turning the main branches horizontal so that more shoots spike out of the nodes, and you will get a much more bushier and healthier plant. And it is usually done best when the stems are soft and pliable. Once the stems become harder, it is harder to wrap them around the obelisk. Try to get to do this early on. I'm going to do this year on my David Austin Lady of Shalott because I bought it as a shrub rose and now it has turned into a climbing rose for the past 2 years. So I have an idea of growing it on a beautiful obelisk in my garden. So I'm going to create a video about it in the future. So make sure that you subscribe so you don't miss out on the video. If you're growing on an arch, just like you would tie it on a stem, make sure you tie all the branches on the arch instead, and you will get the same effect of having a branch tied horizontally to a wire. You will get a similar pattern of shoots coming out of all the nodes, making it into a much healthy and bushier arch and giving you lots and lots of roses. Here's a note if you are growing on an arch. Make sure not to cut off the tips of the long branches because you want these branches to grow as long as possible so that they can cover your entire arch. If you cut them off at the tip, they will not be able to grow and you will have stunted growth and you will not have the entire arch filled with the rose. Now, if this is your first time pruning, I want to give you a few pointers that have helped me over the years pruning my roses. First is, don't be too afraid of where to prune. I used to look at pruning right above the node. And yes, it helps when you do that, but I have noticed it matters a little less on the climbers rather than it matters on your regular rose. When I look at the direction of the node and then prune a rose, it helps the rose spread out more rather than inwards. But on a climber, it doesn't matter so much because they are going to climb on your structure anyways. So don't be too hesitant on where you're cutting the rose. Just look at where it's healthy enough and prune it right there. Also, a second tip is don't worry if you have pruned too much. Roses are resilient and so strong and they will grow back again. Try not to cut them too much, but if you accidentally do, don't stress too much about it. When you are pruning, look at the stability of your plant and see if the plant has not been knocked loose by the wind or a critter. This will be a great time to make sure you stabilize the base, put in some more soil if soil is needed, or if the growth is too much for the rose, then cut back some of the growth so that the plant can establish its roots and you don't end up losing the entire plant. And last tip, and I think this is the most important tip for me because make sure that you don't leave any of the foliage down on the ground for the rest of the season. Clean out those leaves that you have cut or dropped and remove all the branches because you don't want any of the diseases spreading from the previous year to the upcoming year. This one tip will just help you so much in reducing the diseases on your roses for the upcoming year. Let me know if you have any specific questions on how to prune your own roses. But if you're not sure about what climbing roses to get and need more information, check out this video right here, which has all of my favorite climbing roses.